Hello there and welcome to the channel. I'm Dr. Tom Pepper and today I'm going to be giving you a general introduction to how British politics works. So if you're British and you just like a bit of a primer, a bit of a catch up on the basics, or if you're not British and you want to know just a general introduction to our systems, this is the video for you. I'm going to split it into two parts. This first half will cover the sort of basic structure, how constituencies work, the different parties, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and the second half will look specifically at Brexit, which has been such a huge topic over the last 5 years. It deserves a video all of its own, though it's going to come up a lot in this video too. So the best way to begin is to get an understanding of the geography, the sort of geographical politics of the situation. So let's go to our map of the UK. The map here has the Tories in blue. The dark blue is seats the Tories kept, and the light blue you can see sprinkled around is Tory gains. That mostly came from Labour. Labour represented by red. The yellow in the north there is the SNP. That northern bit is Scotland. They've got nearly all of that. The darker yellow orangey bits are the Liberal Democrats. These are all the colours that are typically used to represent the main parties. That little blob on the west there is Wales. You can see some dark green there for the seats Plaid Cymru won. I'll go into all these parties in more detail soon. We have 4 nations in the UK: England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, and each of them is comprised of all these different constituencies. Each constituency is represented by one MP. When it comes to a vote, election time, everyone votes for their local MP. So I might go to the polls and see a choice between a Conservative MP, a Labour MP, a Plaid Cymru MP, a UKIP MP. The potential MP that gets the most votes in that region becomes the actual MP of that constituency and goes to sit in the House of Commons. There are 650 seats in the House of Commons, meaning that if a party gets 326 MPs, they have a voting majority, right? So when laws are voted on in the House of Commons, the Tories can be reasonably sure they're going to get a win as long as they have over 326 MPs, as they do currently. So to be clear, we only vote for a regional candidate, not on who the Prime Minister should be or anything like that. The Prime Minister is simply the leader of the biggest party. So at the moment, our biggest party is the Conservatives, and the leader of that party is Boris Johnson, making him Prime Minister. If a party doesn't get a majority, if they don't get to 326 seats in an election, there's a few options. They can either form a coalition. So say you're 10 seats short, you could form a coalition with a smaller, say 15-seat party. That would give you a working majority as long as the union holds and you do the right kind of horse trading. Or you can just try and run with a majority government. So say you're just short, you're on 320, you want 326. You can just say, well, each time we have a vote, we'll just try to persuade enough MPs from rival parties to vote for our motion that we get through. But minority governments are rarely very stable or very successful. It's certainly not what you want. Here we're looking at the official seat tally currently. So this is different from the results of the latest election in 2019, just because a few people have, say, left their party to become independent. There's been some by-elections. So there's been some changing around. But here we are. So we're at the Conservatives on 360. A comfortable majority. Labour currently on 199 seats, which is terrible for them. 2019 was their worst result since the 1930s. They're doing very badly, but we'll get into that in a moment. The SNP have 45 seats, all in Scotland. They're the Scottish National Party, so they only run in Scotland. Previously, they've had pretty much all of the 60 seats in Scotland, so for them, it's not great. But obviously, they're still incredibly dominant in Scotland, and that gives them a big voice in the UK. The Lib Dems currently on 12 seats, the DUP, an Irish party, are on 8, Sinn Féin, another Irish party, on 7, though due to some complications we'll get into, they don't actually sit in the House of Commons or participate in voting. Alba, another Scottish party that are supposedly in opposition for the SNP, got 2 seats. Plaid Cymru, the Party of Wales, got 3. And we can see that small parties like the Social Democrats got 2, the Greens have 1, and there are 6 independent MPs currently. This helps us to see why a lot of people, and especially a lot of the smaller parties in the UK, are very keen on electoral reform. We currently have a first-past-the-post system, meaning that whoever wins the election in that constituency, they get the seat. So even if you only win by 1 vote, you get the whole seat and all your opponents get nothing. And then if your party gets to a majority, you have pretty much all the power. So it leads to some weird outcomes. So like here nationally, we can see that the Greens have 2.7% of the public vote. So 2.7% of voters voted for them, compared to 43% that voted for the Tories. But the Conservatives have 365 times as many seats, because the Greens couldn't translate their portion of the vote share into having actual seats. Potentially what this means is that you could have a referendum in the UK where everyone votes for either Labour or the Tories, the two main parties. 49% of people vote for Labour, 51% of people vote for the Tories. But if that's the vote share in every single constituency, the Tories will win all the seats. They'll have 650 out of 650 constituencies. They'll have literally all the power, and Labour will get nothing despite 49% of people voting for them. So there's a few solutions proposed, like proportional representation. So maybe something where if the Greens get 2.7% of the vote nationally, they get 2.7% of the seats. That would at least do away with some of the weird irregularities like we see here, where the Tories are getting way more seats proportionally than votes to the Greens. It's kind of a weird situation. And the smaller parties hate it because they never get into power, and they all know they do well out of a change in electoral systems. The big parties, the ones who are in power, know they would do less well, and since they're the ones in power, we never get electoral reform, right? It's kind of like a paradox. Whoever's in power will have come to power on the current system, and since they're already in power, why would they change that? Like, why would you break the ladder you just climbed up when you want to climb up it again? That's not to say that a different system would be all fine and dandy. Like, Europe has different systems that often lead in a lot of coalitions. And coalitions, you kind of think, well, that sounds great, because if lots of people vote for Labour and lots of people vote for the Tories, shouldn't they both get a slice of power? It's not always great, though, because, no one votes for a coalition, right? Like 2010, 2015, we had a coalition between the Tories and the Lib Dems. Now, people voted for the Tories and people voted for the Lib Dems, but absolutely no one voted for a Tory Lib Dem coalition because it wasn't on the ballot paper. And it leads to what we saw in that situation, where the parties kind of feel free to tear up their manifesto promises and not do what they said they were going to do on the campaign trail because they didn't actually get into power, right? Like, everything in their manifesto is premised on, if we get into power, we will do this. So if they're in a coalition, especially, they feel free to not abide by any of their campaign promises, which obviously is a problem in politics anyway, but add coalitions into it and it becomes even more of a problem. Here in Britain, we are also blessed with a second house, the House of Lords. So the House of Commons is made up of the MPs that win their constituencies, and they put forward laws and vote on laws. The laws then go to the House of Lords, and the Lords can propose changes or sometimes send them back. They can't really block a law, but they can suggest changes and gum up the process if they're not happy. There are a total of 783 people in the Lords, more than there are elected officials. None of the Lords are elected themselves. 26 are there because they're bishops or archbishops. 92 of them are there because they have hereditary titles. They're literally only there because of who their parents were. I believe as well that the hereditary rules are still sexist. So some of them are literally there because of who their parents were and that they're men. And this just provides exactly the same kind of problems that we see with electoral reform. The parties that are in power never want to change the Lords because the party in power can appoint more people to the Lords. So if the Tories are in power, they want to stuff the House full with Lords so that the Lords will then pass their bills, and then Labour get in, and to counter that, they need to stuff it full of Labour people. It just goes on and on. It's getting totally out of control. But again, whoever's in power will want to stuff the Lords themselves, so there's no serious talk of reform there. Now that the basics are out of the way, let's take a look at the main parties, the main players here. And the reason I want to go over this in a bit of detail is because I kind of want to show that our system of having lots of different political parties nationally has a few advantages over the American system, where you're pretty much limited to Democrats or Republicans. People might think that the UK is essentially a two-party system because it's basically either Labour or the Tories that are in power. Coalitions might change that, but for the last 100 years, the only political parties to really have any power in the UK officially are the Tories and Labour. But I want to talk through a few of the advantages here. First of those is that, like I say, they can obtain local power. So I think it's the Green Party always win in Brighton, I think it is. So the Green Party have control of the local Brighton Council. Now, that's their only MP, so when it comes to voting on laws in the House of Commons, they can't really do much because it's one vote either way, but they do at least get that local power. Another advantage is simply the choice of it, right? Like when anyone in Britain goes to vote in a general election, they'll usually have at least 5 or 6 parties on the ballot paper. And the third advantage that I'll go into in more detail later on, probably in the second half, is that the multi-party system allows people to express discontent with the main parties much more easily. And I think a multi-party system is the only way really that the people can get won over on the ruling political class. I don't really think in America, if the Republicans and the Democrats don't want something to happen, there's no way it will happen. But in Britain, we had a situation where most sitting MPs, most of the people in power, did not want Brexit to happen. Most of the voters did, and the voters managed to beat them eventually on that. So I think the multi-party system is a really great way, and I'll go into it in more detail, a great way of expressing discontent to force the governing parties to do what the people want them to do. Let's start here by looking at the Conservatives. They're the oldest political party in Britain, I think the oldest political party in the world, since their roots are from like 1720 or whatever. They are obviously conservative. They exist nominally to keep things the same in this country and not change things and be all about tradition and custom. It hasn't really been true since the 1980s when Thatcher took over and changed them in quite a radical way. They became much more small state, much more free market, much more Thatcherite, as we'll call them now. And they've really been that way ever since. After a long period out of power while Blair and then Brown were in power, the Conservatives returned to power in a coalition with the Lib Dems in 2010, and then everything was all about austerity. The financial crash just happened, and David Cameron, the new Prime Minister, needed money to bail out the bankers who had caused the financial crash, so he cut public services to save the money to pay off his buddies, is the essential story of that whole 5-year period. There wasn't really much going on, but being in a coalition always rankled with the Tories. They had to go into a coalition because they didn't get a majority of seats, and they didn't get that because they lost so many votes to UKIP. And UKIP's whole bag was forcing a referendum on independence from the European Union, which the Tories never wanted to do. They didn't want to leave the EU, they didn't want to have a referendum on the subject, but they lost so many votes to UKIP that in 2015 they had to include a referendum in their new manifesto when they ran for election again. Because they'd agreed to have the referendum, they were much more popular. Those voters came back from UKIP. The Tories were elected a majority in 2015, and they got to have their EU referendum. Cameron, because essentially he's a posh boy from Eton who thinks he's never going to lose, just went to the EU referendum thinking he'd win. I mean, everyone thought Remain would win. Everyone thought people would vote to stay in the EU. That's not what happened. And Cameron, despite saying he wouldn't resign if he lost, resigned because he lost pretty much immediately. And this is really the beginning of the story of the last 5 years, just this Brexit chaos that's completely engulfed the political system. Cameron walked and Theresa May took over for 2 years. To be honest, I could probably make it through this video without mentioning Theresa May. She never really established an identity for herself. She came in as oh, I'm a safe pair of hands. I'm not crazy about Remain or Leave. But she really couldn't get the party united behind her. Some Tories did want to stay in the EU despite the results of the referendum. Plenty wanted to leave immediately because of the result of the referendum. And Theresa May could never please them all. She took a gamble in 2017 by deciding to call an election because she thought that Labour, the opposition, looked weak. The gamble didn't pay off. She got not quite a majority, I think, was just several seats short of majority. She did way worse than she expected, way worse than anyone expected, and she had to cut a very grubby backroom deal with the Irish party, essentially literally giving them millions of pounds so that they would vote for her policies. Nothing really ever came of it because she wasn't in power long. It was just 2 years of complete debacle until she finally admitted she couldn't do the job and quit. Thus ended one of the worst prime ministerships in the history of the country. In about a 300-year history, it really was a disaster. Not entirely her fault, obviously, events and circumstances and what have you, but it was dreadful. Anyway, after that, Boris Johnson took over. He became leader of the Tory party, but he still had the majority inherited from Theresa May, since when we change prime minister, you don't need to have an election, though it's usually a good idea to get some sort of a democratic legitimacy. Boris indeed did call an election in the winter of 2019, and because he leant really hard on Brexit and was saying we definitely will get Brexit through, while Labour had gone to saying we want a second referendum on the Brexit question, the Tories did very well. They got their 360 seats, well clear of a majority, pretty much wiped out Labour, gave them a terrible result, and Boris became Prime Minister as he still is today. Because he promised to deliver Brexit, and Brexit was mostly supported by a lot of people in Northern England, and a lot of working class people, he got a lot of seats the Tories don't normally get. And to try and keep them, he wants them to vote Tory again. He's claiming that his party is all about dropping austerity now, refunding public services, levelling up areas of the country that have always been poor or deprived. But realistically, of course, his government has mostly been on the back foot because Brexit's been happening, and that's certainly difficult to navigate. And also, of course, coronavirus struck like 4 months, I guess, after they won their election and were starting to get things done. So really, the government has been defined by those two issues, Brexit and coronavirus. Like, it's hard to characterise them on policy. What they have been characterised on is sleaze and corruption, which at this point is just a fact of British political life. It is rotten to the core, and it doesn't look like anything's going to change anytime soon. We've had incompetence, sexual assault, bribery, lobbying, like all in a very short period of time. The Tories are kind of renowned for their sleaze, and they really are bad. That's not to say Labour would be any better if they got into power, but fact is, Tories have been in power for 10 years. They're quite comfortable now, and a lot of them have become corrupt. We've recently been rocked by the Owen Paterson scandal. A guy had several second jobs lobbying for all these private firms. Basically, they pay him to vote the way they want him to vote. When I say it out that, it sounds like it should be illegal, but I don't think it is. He might have broken a rule here or there, but the Tories then tried to engineer a vote to change those rules to keep him safe. Basically, he was corrupt. The Tories tried to cover up for him. They did it incompetently, and now everyone's mad at everyone. You think this would be terrible for the Tories, but not so, because the opposition is so unpopular. Like, every now and then, I think once or twice over the last few years, Labour have overtaken the Tories in the polls, and they did recently after this Owen Paterson scandal. But they never stay there. People just turn off the Tories and go to don't knows. They never go back to Labour. So the Tories just don't really care. They can get busted for corruption, 10 times a day. It doesn't make a difference because they have no opposition, so they're not going to lose their seats. I do have to stress how rare and weird this situation is. It's only the last 5 years, really, that the opposition has ever been behind a government in midterms. Normally, historically, the government that was in power could really only screw up, right? Like, if you're in the opposition, you just say, oh, I wouldn't have done that, I would have done this. Like, even if opposition parties went on to lose in general elections very badly, in midterms, they were always ahead. And it was just a fact of political life. Last 5 years, Labour have not been, and that's because they lost a bunch of working class support because of Brexit. A word I keep saying, we'll come on to that more. But basically, this is a very freak occurrence. The opposition is incredibly unpopular in the midterms, despite COVID and Brexit and the scandals and the corruptions, despite everything. So it's really hard to see how Labour are ever going to, well, not ever, it's hard to see how they're going to take power from the Tories anytime soon. The next election needs to happen by 2024. A lot of pundits say Boris will call an election earlier because the opposition is so weak and because those COVID numbers are going to start recovering, people think. And once the big line on the economy is going up, Boris will feel like he can call an election and just hope everyone forgets that COVID was an absolute nightmare. It'll probably work just because Labour are so far down in the polls and in terms of seats. They don't have any Scottish seats anymore because they've lost them all to the SNP. They don't have a lot of their usual traditional seats anymore. So it's very difficult mathematically to see how they can possibly win the next election. Best they can hope to do is gain a lot of ground, make themselves look like a proper party again, and then the next election try and win that. But that could be 2029. So at the moment we have a situation where the Tories are these obviously despicable villains, but they're going to be here another 10 years essentially, giving them a total of about 20 years in power from 2010 to 2029, and that's only if they lose 2029, which they might not.